Oh, thank you for that lovely introduction. You were trying to make me cry, I think, before I give this talk, but it was lovely. And I will say I'm neither going to disprove or prove that I am a vampire. I'll leave that up to the rumor mill to decide. It's my pleasure to be with you all tonight for an evening of ghosts and mystery and history. But before I begin, I'd really like to thank the Altmayer family, and Jay is over here, for your wonderful generosity, without which this work would not be done. Your generosity has allowed me to present my scholarship and my poetry at academic conferences, helped me to create a documentary with Tom Lear, with the inspiration of Kathleen Orange, about a service learning project that my students and I have been conducting for a few years. And it's also allowed me to purchase a set of newly reissued Gothic novels that hadn't been printed since the early 1800s, so I was very excited when those came out on the market and I was able to gather them. But most importantly, I'd like to thank you for caring about the intellectual and the creative endeavors of the Division of Languages and Literature. You've had a big impact on us and our teaching, our intellectual journeys, our creative work, and I'm so deeply grateful. Thank you so much. Finally, I'd like to thank my students, and some of you are here, for the joy that y'all give me. All of my colleagues who are here in the division and throughout the college for the support and the friendship you've given me over these years. And also for everybody here tonight who is part of this wonderful Spring Hill College community. So thank you. So are you ready to be scared? Ready to be Gothified? When one thinks of 19th century Gothic novels, we often think of Frankenstein, Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde. Portraying monsters both within and outside the self, authors like Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley explore fears such as those related to psychology, disease, science, or psychology, or inside the heart or the human mind. 18th century Gothic novels are a little bit different. They're much more formulaic and melodramatic. They might kind of seem like soap operas a little bit, and people are always running and crying and fainting and throwing hysterical fits. But at any rate, they usually feature a heroine looking for her identity while trying to dodge the occasional lustful monk, tyrannical father figure, and finally solving forever what is that secret behind that mysterious curtain. You can see these are just a few of the many pictures that I was able to find of mysterious curtains. There's also a lustful monk you can see about to kill somebody. At any rate, novelists in this tradition are usually setting their novels in medieval France or medieval Italy, and they explore such anxieties as oppressive religious, political, or familial hierarchies, control of one's, usually female, body, and the containment of the irrational. And this is where my work comes in. Beyond the more popularly studied 18th century Gothic novels by authors such as Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and Horace Walpole, exists a considerable and neglected body of Gothic fiction that combines the Gothic tale with elements of historical romance. While historical Gothic novels may seem to be formalistic failures or pre-Walter Scott attempts at the historical novel, closer studies of these popular fictional works reveals their greater significance within the context of Enlightenment formulations of history. One of the first questions I asked myself was, why in the world would you claim historical truth in a tale that's so obviously full of monsters and ghosts and supernatural occurrences? In my paper, I'm going to be examining how late 18th century Gothic novels portray this idea of history, and how, in doing so, they not only illuminate period debates about the term history, but also uncover projects of nation building inherent to history writing. At the same time, these Gothics also point to an underlying uneasiness surrounding historiography or history writing itself, that writing history does not serve the proposed function of constructing a coherent national identity. So imagine instead of a monster or a ghost chasing you as you run down the dark corridor, the lightning crashing above, scary sounds behind you, you turn and suddenly you see, oh my God. No, this is not a medieval zombie, and it's not a testament to the horrors of using lead-based face paint. Actually, it is Queen Elizabeth I. Departing from traditional Enlightenment histories that emphasize linearity, logical causation, and rational explanations for both human behavior and cultural progress, these Gothic novels continually rupture their own portrayals of history, emphasize the irrational, and dismantle illusions about history's power, objectivity, endurance, and ability to formulate an uncontested national subject. Selecting history itself as a locus of terror and the uncanny, historical Gothic novels, through their strange combination of the supernatural and the historical, provide a unique glimpse into the cultural uneasiness surrounding 18th century attempts at historical representation. Do we have any historians here? Well, yes. I'm a little nervous about the historians when I work on this topic because in my study of the Gothic novel's intersections with national history, I'm approaching the subject here from the viewpoint of a literary scholar. Thus, my main focus centers more upon how the Gothic novel portrays the idea of history, its uses, and its transmission. I set out to examine history as a trope in a set of literary texts rather than to write a theory of history or to explore the many complexities associated with the rise of historiography in the 18th century, though I would be glad to talk about this with you some other day. I will, however, devote this section to a summary of the major issues that are germane to my argument. David Hume's famous assertion, "I believe this to be the historical age and this the historical nation," points not only to the 18th century's growing interest in history, but also to history's importance to a sense of a nation's distinct identity. The emergence of modern historiography is now commonly located in the 18th century. 18th century beliefs about historical representation, including that the past can be accurately discovered and portrayed, and that there exists a concrete truth about the past, have all been aptly depicted by contemporary historians of history. Related ideas that become more important in the century involved the belief in human progress, the reliance on models of scientific empiricism, and the description of history as a coherent, linear process, moving steadily and clearly onward. For Enlightenment historians, impressions of the past ought to be objective, separate from religious or political bias, and based on reason and realism. As Jane Lewis points out about the 18th century, quote, "New British histories prided themselves on their use of common sense and shared standards of evidence, especially as these diffused the violent partisan fervor that had surcharged the past." Shifting historiographical methodologies and differing uses of the past to describe contemporary political and cultural issues had important ramifications for national identity. As the notion of history representing the progress of a nation took stronger hold on the British imagination, constructing the past in order to emphasize that progress became more visible and more important. Just as Enlightenment historians generally strove to create a linear, coherent, and accurate narrative, so too did the nationalist impulse following it. Indeed, quote, "Georgian historiography may be seen as the verbal equivalent of a national monument, as an attempt to create a shared and ultimately self-congratulatory impression of the past." In order to create this shared past, historical conflicts and differences needed to be suppressed in favor of the nationalist cause and the story of nation. As Linda Colley explains in her study of British nationalism, Britain's Forging the Nation, 1707 to 1837, creating and believing in the fiction of national unity based on a shared and unified past allowed the British to, quote, "define themselves as a single people, not because of any political or cultural consensus at home, but rather in reaction to the other beyond their shores. Britishness was superimposed over an array of internal differences in response to contact with the other, and above all, in response to conflict with the other. In other words, the idea of nation depended on these fictions of homogeneity and of the nation's shared identity and shared history. Narratives of cultural and political progress could be invoked to explain away violent conflicts of the past. The present structures of government, of course, could be said to have evolved away from such mistakes. Scholars like April Alliston and Mark Phillips have brought greater attention to the role sympathy played in the reading and writing of 18th century histories. In the later half of the 18th century, shifting interest towards emotion and empathy brought about changes in the way history was approached. More and more historical writers in the 18th century stressed the importance of sympathy as the building block of social bonds and culture. Indeed, quote, for the first time, evocation became an important goal of historical narrative, and sympathetic identification came to be seen as one of the pleasures of historical reading. Often, histories of the period sounded very much like sentimental novels in their portrayal of characters, events, and emotions. In fact, there's a passage in one of Hume's histories about Queen Margaret is fleeing the castle with her child, and she's overcome by bandits, and she escapes while they're dividing the spoils, and then she runs into another thief and throws herself at his mercy, and he's a good guy, so he stops being a thief and he helps her. But the first time I read that, I thought, oh my God, this is just like a Gothic novel. This is exactly the kind of high drama and passion that would be happening. I never would have expected it to be in the pages of a history until I started working in this. So let's move into the Gothic itself now. The combination of actual history and supernatural Gothic might seem rather strange until one shifts one's attention away from how factual the novel is or isn't, and instead to why the novel even attempts to include real history at all. This novel brings to the forefront anxieties about Britain's actual political past and its narratives of cultural unity and national identity. The main character's quest, two heroines, has to do with legitimating their identity as the daughters of Mary, Queen of Scots. As they attempt to prove their right to the throne and enter into the world of the court, the young women follow these very methods common in 18th century historiography in order to write themselves into history. However, they find that history writing can take on a monstrous life of its own, and madness lies in wait for those who attempt to grasp its fiery pen. The novel I'm going to talk about tonight is Sophia Lee's The Recess, which is one of several historical Gothics that I've been researching. Sophia Lee's 18th century Gothic novel, The Recess, is set in Britain, unlike many Gothics that are usually set in Europe, and features real historical events and real historical people who must encounter ghosts, gore, madness, horror, and other Gothic trappings like secret passageways and tunnels. The novel tells the fictional history of twin daughters separated at birth from their mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. Often portrayed in the 18th century as a beautiful and victimized sentimental heroine, Mary, Queen of Scots appears in this novel as the virtuous mother who sacrifices herself to save her daughters. The two girls are hidden away in a secret recess that is actually underneath a chapel. And they are raised by the loving and virtuous Mrs. Marlowe, who gives up her life in the outside world in order to protect and educate the girls. The novel itself poses as a real history, faithfully documented in order to prove the two regal daughters' claims to the throne and their rightful place in history. Indeed, these two young women become two budding historians, concerned as much with their portrayal of history as with their rightful claim to the throne. There are two twin narratives that go with each of these twins. The first is Matilda. Matilda's narrative traces the girl's early life hidden away in the recess. Their discovery of their true parentage and her secret marriage to Leicester occur. A favorite of Queen Elizabeth, who is ever suspicious and very Gothic, Leicester must continually dodge her attempts at discovering their secret marriage. When she eventually does, he flees with the pregnant Matilda to France, where he is murdered and she is imprisoned in a convent where the nuns try to terrorize her into becoming Catholic. Evidently, Mary Queen of Scots' daughters aren't Catholics, they're Protestants. It's fine. After a midnight escape with her husband's coffin, with the body in it, more treachery, the birth of her daughter during a storm on the boat, imprisonment and escape, Matilda finally returns to English soil many years later, only to find that all evidence of her marriage and birthright have been destroyed. The other sister, Ellinor's narrative splits off from Matilda's narrative at the point of Matilda's attachment to Leicester. We find that she has always mistrusted Leicester. Indeed, she falls in love with his rival, Essex. Left behind in England when Matilda and Leicester flee, she ends up bearing the brunt of Elizabeth's rage. During her own flight from England, she experiences the Irish battlefield, the death of her odious husband, her reunion with Essex, and her eventual descent into madness. That during Lee's day, the novel stimulated discussion on the use of history according to Enlightenment standards points to the recess's larger significance as a register of 18th century questions and anxieties about historiography. Favorable comparisons of Lee's novel with the great British histories written by Hume and Robertson appeared in the same reviews that voiced suspicion about this combination of fiction and history in general. Some reviews also observed the larger danger that readers might actually confuse the two forms of writing. And one of them was Anna Letitia Barbauld. For example, she shows a concern that Lee's novel, with its combination of fiction and British history, could affect readers' interpretations of their own country's past. She states, quite correctly actually, that Lee's romance has led to, quote, a prejudice against the character of our Elizabeth, arising from her cruelty to two imaginary daughters of Mary, Queen of Scots, who never existed, but in the pages of a novel. Barbauld attacks here not simply Lee's combination of fiction and history, but more specifically how it portrays British history in general, or in particular, and Lee's manipulation of readers' interpretation of our Elizabeth, one of the greatest political figures in British history. This disapproval points to a larger desire to protect an agreed-upon national story. So back to the novel. In her novel and preface, Sophia Lee highlights her historical methodology and features characters concerned with gathering an accurate history. Matilda and Ellinor discover, however, that to make history, both in terms of creating a record of it and in terms of entering into it themselves, is an activity fraught with danger and horror. Though they may use all the devices and evidence available to them, and though they may follow various approaches to historiography, the young women eventually become hopelessly embroiled in their historical endeavors. In the end, they learn to their misfortune that making history is not as simple as recording objective truths backed up with evidence, or even creating a sentimentalized version of history in order to elicit reader sympathy. Instead, making history requires official sanction in order to have any kind of power to begin with. Gothic effects surround with horror scenes where making history fails, and where history cannot contain or smooth over cultural conflict using the guise of sympathy. Uncannily enough, it is the Gothic discourse that shows the way to real political power. A novel made up of correspondence from multiple narrators who relate the same events differently, The Recess features numerous textual ruptures and involves sentimental, historical, and Gothic discourse, all of which complicate each other. And now I'm going to entertain you with my amazing skills at drawing a graph to show you how these narratives work together or don't work together. Okay, so there you go. You can laugh if you want to. So you'll notice that the blue line would be the events, the things that happen. The red flashes, those would be moments of either intra-national discord or conflict or cultural conflict in the event of history. In the 18th century, as in this novel, you often will see the sentimental narrative covering over those things. Yeah, Mary, Queen of Scots was dangerous and she was trying to take the throne, but she was so beautiful and she cried when they put her in prison, and she was in love, and her hair is just beautiful, and oh my gosh, Mary. At any rate, we'll talk a little bit about what the results of that are in a moment, but the Sentimental narrative, maybe kind of like Pepto-Bismol or something, but it kind of covers over these yucky moments, and then allows the happy green patriotic narrative of unified national identity to progress. The only problem is that in this novel, Gothic moments pop up during these moments of intra-national or cultural clash, and don't let you forget about them. They change the sentimental reaction to a horrified reaction, and it's no longer easy to just say, well, you know, Mary, but she was so beautiful and so lovely. So anyway, now I'll explain it a little more. The Gothic's ability to turn sympathy into horror graphically undercuts the sentimental discourse that surrounds historical transmission in this novel, and it's the same kind of sentimental discourse found in histories in this period as well. Gothic conventions, including ghostly guises, subterranean hideouts in prisons, supernatural visits from historical figures, live burials, obsessions with coffins and other mementos of death, and gruesome violence that erupts both in the novel's history and in the heroines' hearts, all throw into doubt the sentimental narrative's ability to cover over historical horrors involving Great Britain. Surrounding sites of historical strife in England, Scotland, and Ireland with Gothic events and elements, the recess also belies any attempt at using history to depict a unified national narrative. In the novel, characters demonstrate self-consciousness about reading and writing history, as well as gathering and preserving documents, objects, and other forms of evidence according to empirical standards. Frequently, characters will share with each other their knowledge of actual historical people and events. Characters are also aware of their own position in history and even highlight the necessity of learning history. Throughout the novel, Lee will use the language of sentiment to portray not only the girls' histories, but also the histories of real-life figures such as Mary, Leicester, Essex, and Elizabeth. Indeed, most of the history documented in the novel is sentimental history, particularly due to its focus on an icon of sentimental feeling, Mary, Queen of Scots. Scholars have spent a lot of time looking at the 18th century fascination with Mary, Queen of Scots, even calling it the cult of Mary. She was sort of the quintessential sentimental heroine, and I'm only half joking when I say, but she was so lovely, and it was so sad. Anyway, and by the way, people did kind of mistake that Matilda and Ellinor were real, and somebody actually put up fake grave sites, similar to Charlotte Temple, for those of you who work in the American. Lee aligns her heroine's various political concerns with the desire to kindle affection and sympathy in the hearts of those whom they encounter and whom they imagine will read their history in the future. To the end of the novel, Matilda sees herself as an important historical person deserving of remembrance and validation, not simply because she is a sentimental heroine, but because she has been involved in history. The recess demonstrates a self-consciousness about what history is and can do through frequent mention and exploration of history throughout the novel. This concern multiplies through the various narratives making up the single history, the novel, and its questions about what counts as evidence, how feeling plays a role in politics, and how to distinguish the real from the imaginary. Throughout the recess, Sophia Lee invokes Gothic conventions to highlight the slippery nature of historical proof and to depict the uneasiness that results when events are uncontrollable by or when history itself becomes unknowable in history writing. Matilda's and Ellinor's sufferings not only result from their oppression from Elizabeth, but also follow from their continued and naive belief that their evidence will prove the truth in the end, if not in their lifetime, then in the future. The novel frequently includes actual historical content and talks about history openly. Readers learn about the achievements of Sir Walter Raleigh, the political intrigues concerning Sir Philip Sidney, Queen Mary's marriage to Bothwell and flight to England, and the succession of James I to the throne. Matilda and Ellinor pore over portraits of historical scenes and people. In the midst of these events, characters draw attention to the fact that they are recording or telling histories, both personal and political. And this was also something that would have been familiar to the reading audience of such novels, largely women. The 18th century was a time when history became a very important part of a woman's education, and women would write letters to each other about what they had read about history. It was something that you could be proud of if you were able to talk about historical facts. And so we see this echoed in our characters in this novel. Concern about visual evidence begins and ends the novel. Matilda is told she looks exactly like her mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, and later uses her face as evidence when seeking help from James. The girls disguise themselves when at court, fearful that Elizabeth will see this very physical evidence. Visual evidence can also be mistaken, however, and it does not remain as permanent as one might hope. Cross-dressing and disguises often appear in the novel. Ellinor dresses as a man when pursuing her lover Essex to Ireland and ends up on the battlefield. In one scene, Ellinor escapes the watchful spies of Elizabeth by switching places with a corpse that's about to be buried, and she gets buried. Unfortunately, this leads her true love, Essex, to believe that she really is dead, and he almost loses the battle against the Irish. Events such as these reinforce the narrative strategy of misreading and disagreement so evident in the novel. They also emphasize how hard it can be to control both the evidence and its interpretation. At any rate, when weighing personal evidence against written evidence takes precedence. Characters throughout the novel demand or discover written proof of various claims, yet these methods of evidence also emerge as susceptible to falsehood or impermanence. When Elizabeth comes upon the actual papers on Elizabeth's person attesting that Matilda and Ellinor are the biological and legitimate daughters of Mary, she tears them to pieces and imprisons Ellinor, thus destroying the written evidence for the girl's birth and secreting away the physical evidence of Ellinor's face. Furthermore, she forces Ellinor to marry Lord Arlington, who calls Ellinor's documents of her parentage forged testimonials of an impossible marriage and supposititious birth. Ellinor retorts, forged testimonials? Why then did she so carefully destroy them? The question of evidence becomes further complicated when Elizabeth forces Ellinor to sign a confession, included in very full detail, at very full length, in the novel, complete with lots of legal jargon and names of many different witnesses. Ellinor gives in to the demands and signs the statement that the twins' claims are fictitious, hoping to spare her mother Mary from death. But unlike Elizabeth's similar destruction of written testimony, Ellinor's destruction of the warrant does nothing to stop Mary's execution. What all these instances have in common is the way in which eyewitness, physical, or written evidence don't really count unless sanctioned by those in power. Matilda and Ellinor depend upon recognition for their ascendance to high rank. They do not, for example, gather their own army and take the throne by force. It would seem so much easier to do that. Anyway, several sympathetic alliances seem to allow for this aid and recognition, but in the end, affectionate connections do not help the women's cause. Leicester and Essex, the women's lovers, both hold political and financial power, but they prove to be too dependent upon the favors of Elizabeth and too vulnerable to the intrigues at court to be effective. Matilda and Ellinor, who through the first part of the novel are almost one soul, as they keep saying over and over again, the minute Leicester comes in on the scene and Matilda falls in love with him, all bets are off. And Ellinor hates Leicester and Matilda hates Essex, and they both think that the men are using her sister, to get back at Elizabeth or to gain the power of Mary, who any day now may be freed from prison. Quite the love triangle, or quadrangle, I guess. King James of Scotland, another potential ally because of the family bond, also rejects his sisters Ellinor and Matilda, viewing them as a threat. So relying solely upon the sympathies of political allies, Matilda and Ellinor find that they cannot transmit meaning, let alone history. Lee links the successful transmission of meaning through evidence and recorded history to the will of those already in power. This connection highlights the myth of historical objectivity or authority unaffected by pre-existing power dynamics. Even though the women understand how to create and use history, adopting the methods and language of Enlightenment historiography, they've not completely understood how to make history because they do not quite understand the role of political force. I blame growing up in the recess for that. Ellinor's documents fail because the Queen says they're false and destroys them. On the other hand, Ellinor's coerced written confession takes precedence over her spoken word or bodily evidence because that confession is sanctioned by the Queen. Elizabeth's and her followers' tyranny take place on both a personal level through imprisonment, threats of bodily harm, something very typical in other Gothic novels, but also on an epistemological level in the questions of who knows the real history and who gets to say what is the real history. The act of writing history and depending upon it as a politically empowering force, as the twins do, proves to be a dangerous gamble, one that is doomed to failure unless the twins can first wrest political power for themselves. Alas, by the end of the novel, history is crafted by those in power has already passed on, and the twins have been left behind unknown. So now let's talk about the good stuff. Blood, murder, madness, and history. This is actually a portrait showing the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. There are many, many such portraits out there. Quite an interesting, project to look at. Almost all of them are highly sentimentalized, especially ones that were crafted in the 18th century. Characters tend to focus on the more gory events of the past, not surprising because it's a Gothic novel, which, along with the fascination of madness, increases the Gothic presence. Ellinor imagines, for example, the bloody death of her father on the block. Quote, "The premature fate of my much-honored father Norfolk returns upon my memory. The tower, the dismal tower, scaffolds, axes, a bleeding lover, and a broken heart daily passed in a long array before me." Matilda, early in the novel, is haunted by the ghastly body of the servant Williams, which seemed forever to impede our footsteps, floating the path with blood. Hearing about her death of her mother Mary, Queen of Scots, portrayed in many paintings like this one, Matilda is aghast with horror as she imagines her heart sinking into a sea of blood. Emphasizing again the failure of language or sympathy to help her, Matilda finds herself, quote, "unable to reduce the torrent of my ideas into language," and asks everyone to leave her to her morbid thoughts, which include, quote, "the savage hand of Elizabeth dipped in the blood of an anointed sister sovereign." The image of Mary on the block, quote, "every agony of death doubled by the knowledge that her daughter brought her there." Her wish to be destroyed by lightning or, quote, "entombed in the sea." And then at Leicester's murder scene, Matilda bathed her bosom in the blessed crimson which still flowed from his, unquote. She also develops the aforementioned obsession with his coffin and keeps it with her wherever she goes. Descriptions such as these transform the sentimental response with its sympathetic connection between reader and object into the horrified response with its terrible disconnection. And you might think back to the graphic I showed you with the lightning rupturing the narrative so they're no longer unified. Several of these gory images describe events that happened in actual history. Exaggerating the language to depict them in all their horror is frightening not only because of the images they bring to the reader's contemplation, but also because of the implicit potential these descriptions possess to cause the reader to turn away in horror from his or her own nation's history, just as the reviewer Anna Barbauld feared. Ellinor's descent into madness, however, serves as the most important Gothic element in the novel. Several instances of Ellinor's madness appear at the same time that concerns over evidence and historical transmission occur. Sometimes madness occurs when Ellinor's attempts to make history are actually thwarted. So the linkage between Ellinor's madness and historical transmission further connects historiography with horror, as it is the twins' constant attempt to make history that leads to them suffering. Originally, Mary wanted her daughters to grow up and live in the recess and never come out to the world of the court because she had hoped to prevent this. But the girls become obsessed not just with their own political legitimacy, but also with making sure that they are historical figures too. And that is what takes them out of the recess and on the journey to their adventures. Madness first surfaces during the scene of Ellinor's forced confession. Forced to sign a piece of evidence that will be used against her, Ellinor loses authorial control of the proof of her birth that she was going to use to assure her place in history. Madness occurs immediately after this history slips out of her hands. At times, Ellinor is aware of her madness, such as when she says, "I fear I begin to wander. My handwriting appears to my own eyes to be that of Essex. Oh, how tight is my head. My heart seems bound. Will no one loosen the shrunk fibers? Hark, is that not the Queen? No, it was but the deep voice of the winter's wind." Combining historiography and madness through the person of Ellinor, Lee shows not only the way in which madness is a logical result of women's oppression, like other Gothic novels do, but also how madness surrounds the myth that historiography in itself can lend one power, or indeed that it is even something that can be controlled by the individual who exists outside the larger narrative of a nation's history and identity. Ellinor's history and her narrative surrounds some of the worst instances of oppression with outbreaks of madness and violence, further calling attention to these injustices. Unlike Matilda's anger, which regularly transforms and disperses itself into sentimental sighs and tears, Ellinor's anger comes through clearly during these moments of madness and represents the reality of their situation more forcefully. She becomes more violent and sees things around her to be more violent as well. When talking of her oppressive husband Arlington, she says, "He drags me about with him still and calls me his. Oh, heavens. But I am nobody else's. Mark that, or we shall perhaps have murder." Her madness refuses to allow the reader to lapse into acceptance or understanding, as happens in Matilda's narrative, which relies upon sympathetic connection with the reader. Instead, at the very point where Ellinor retreats to safety at last and feels her sanity return, and finally just believes she can forget the past, the madness returns with full force. And she says, "A thunderbolt falls on my brain. Avenging heaven, why does it not wholly split it? Tried, sentenced, condemned, while I, entombed in a now detested solitude, gaily dreamt of endless happiness. Oh, let me once more rush madly into the world, overwhelm my agonized senses with the shouts of armies, the groans of the dying, fountains of blood, rivers of tears. Find, if possible, a horror in nature that may counteract that now raging in my soul." She's got a lot to say, this Ellinor. Eventually gaining a daring in her madness, Ellinor is the sister who finally confronts the Queen with threat to harm her. It's only when Ellinor abandons sympathy and concern for historical transmission that does she finally make history. Ironically, it's breaking out of the rational historical record that allows Ellinor the real power, the real physical and linguistic power to overcome the Queen. Her madness and association with death and the supernatural succeed where the twins' earlier attempts to use the tools of politically approved history and Enlightenment historiography for themselves fail. By associating real political power with Gothic discourse, Lee provides the solution to historiography's horrible tendency to slip from the twins' control. Ellinor herself slips from history's control. She's no longer confined by evidence turned against her. She's no longer constricted by a dependence on objectivity. She's no longer involved in a mission to gain the sympathy of those around her, either in her own era or some readers in the future. And she's no longer bewitched by a belief that she can break into history as a key player. Instead, she turns physical violence directly at the source of her oppression, that great figure in English history, our Queen Elizabeth. Rebellion here finally becomes more important than making history. The subversive energy behind the Gothic's transformation of history occurs when the mad Ellinor rushes into Queen Elizabeth's bedchamber. She at last charges the queen with her murderous crimes and gives full vent to her anger. Taking Elizabeth's hand, she shrieks with horror. Don't worry, I'm not going to shriek, but, "Oh, you have dipped mine in blood, a mother's blood. I am all contaminated. It runs cold to my very heart. Oh, no, it is the blood of Essex. And have you murdered him at last, in spite of your dotage and your promises? All because he could not love you. How we have laughed at such preposterous folly, ha! But I have done with laughing now. We will talk of graves and shrouds and churchyards." I just want to say the slide, those are not moose antlers coming out of Elizabeth. They're little cherubs, but every time I see this picture, I think it's a moose. Anyway, okay. You'll also notice the skeleton on the right, the representation of death, and also a representation of melancholy. Having thought that Ellinor was dead, the ailing queen believes she sees a specter, drags the attending Lady Pembroke to her, and convulsing cries, save me, O Pembroke, save me from this ghastly specter," and those moose antlers. Elizabeth, elsewhere described as all-powerful, becomes a fainting, terrified, vulnerable creature in the face of the ghostly Ellinor. In this guise, Ellinor accomplishes what the twins have spent most of the novel attempting, overcoming the queen. So, would one have thought it possible to break that hard heart after all? And yet, I have done it. As Lady Pembroke later relates of Elizabeth's senses, quote, "The terror she endured has shook them forever. Shuddering with apprehensions for which only I know, she often holds incomprehensible conferences, complains of an ideal visitor, commands every door to be shut, yet still fancies she sees her and orders her to be kept out in vain." Now, in actual history, Elizabeth did experience a sinking depression until her death, and in this moment, Lee portrays Ellinor as affecting the real historical event, not reacting to it, suffering from it, sighing about it, or trying to record it. Here at last, Ellinor makes history. In order to do this, though, Ellinor must herself become part of history's horror. She must adopt the monstrous guise in order to appropriate power. A second major way in which Lee utilizes the Gothic to point out the horrors lurking beneath the surface of Enlightenment historiography involves surrounding with Gothic moments certain locations and objects connected to conflicts within a nation's own history. This technique highlights the historical narrative's inability to cover over any such reminders of national disunity and intra-cultural violence by depicting those moments in graphic relief. Gothic conventions surround these sites with two horrors. First, they give horror to those suffering the real violence and oppression in a nation's history. And from another angle, they show the fearful dread that a nation's violent past cannot be contained by a traditional historical narrative of national identity. The recess itself, perhaps the most important location in the novel, serves not only as a hiding place for the princesses, but also historically served as a hiding place for Catholics during the Reformation. Through the recess, Lee aligns Mary's suffering daughters with the oppressed Catholics, both victims of Protestant England and both threats to the English throne. Lee conceals any impending danger, at least initially though, by crafting Matilda and Ellinor as loci of pity and sorrow in the novel. Surrounding the recess with seemingly supernatural occurrences, secret doors, and all of that, and selecting it as the setting for some of the novel's most frightening scenes, however, Lee marks it as the space of cultural conflict and a constant, frightening reminder of political tension hiding beneath the surface. Because it can be a place of fear and horror as well as of refuge, the recess provides a reminder of a danger hiding within the deeper corners of the novel's narrative, a danger represented by the figure of Mary, Queen of Scots, that Lee associates with this place, the recess. In her study of the cultural significations of Mary, Queen of Scots, Jane Elizabeth Lewis states that almost from the beginning, Queen Mary, quote, summoned tears bound to display the moral authenticity and fellow feeling of those who shed them. Tears that also reminded modern Scots and Englishmen, Protestants and Catholics, Jacobites and Hanoverian Whigs of their ostensibly shared history. In short, Mary offered a common object of sympathy in a mercifully receding past. But since in reality that past had been bitterly divisive, with the Queen of Scots one conspicuous reason why, sentimental investment in her was always risky. 18th century fascination with Mary, Queen of Scots depended upon covering up the turmoil and politics of her actual life and instead crafting her as the ultimate suffering heroine who is lovely and beautiful and was in love. At the same time, quote, the half-French, devoutly Catholic mother of the disgraced Stuart dynasty threatened to expose the collective self-approval as a convenient fantasy. In her novel, Lee's use of Gothic conventions pushes this exposure over the edge. The sentimental narrative urges pity even for those who may be other, like Mary, and using the guise of sympathetic feeling covers over her real threat, sort of like that pink narrative line. The Gothic narrative ruptures this sentimental mandate with scenes of violence, madness, and horror, and reminds the readers of the danger existing alongside or beneath the sentimental version of this historical figure. Her very real threat, and by extension her fictional daughter's threat, as a Catholic and a Scot, come through only in glimpses, but those glimpses are made more striking by the symbolism of the recess, and another staple of Gothic fiction to which it is linked, the convent. Oh, not that convent, that one's too happy. More like this one, okay. Scary one. Comparing the recess with the convent reveals a fundamental contradiction in the way that Lee portrays religious conflict within a country versus religious conflict between countries. Later in the novel, Lee will demonstrate strong anti-Catholic sentiments when talking of French nuns' attempts to convert Matilda, who's somehow safely a Protestant, no need to make that Catholic threat to the throne too real, to her mother's Catholic religion. The seemingly inconsistent portrayal of Catholics actually emphasizes the difference between a danger lurking within a nation's own past and the past of a foreign nation, defined as other. Again, examining the Gothic location of this conflict lends particular attention to 18th century political conflicts. Like the recess, the convent, a place of religious and political discord in the novel, features Gothic elements. Matilda and Leicester flee to France in hopes of gaining political support from Queen Mary's allies and relatives. Unfortunately, they're betrayed. Their riches are taken away, and Leicester is murdered. Matilda ends up imprisoned in a convent. The nuns, whom Matilda called the bigoted dictators of religion, follow stereotypes of 18th century anti-Catholicism that is so often found in traditional Gothic novels. And this is actually a very, very common stereotype in 18th century Gothic novels, although I would argue that even as we have a novel like The Monk, where he just does everything he shouldn't do, there are also some very good examples of religious men and women. So I wouldn't necessarily say the Gothic is anti-Catholic, but there are definitely very strong streaks of it. Viewing Leicester as an outcast, the nuns refused to inter his corpse and urged Matilda to be grateful that her sin of marrying outside the church can now be expiated through prayer and penance in the convent. Instead, though, she feels entombed alive and develops an obsession with her husband's coffin, which has been secreted away in an unhallowed vault. With the aid of a much more sympathetic man, Matilda flees from the place one night, but not without taking her husband and his coffin with her. All these images, and they did make fun of her for that, but she wasn't going to leave without it, so sometimes you just have to do what she says. All these images, the tomb, the coffin, the vault, point back to the recess and create a strong connection between the convent in France and the recess in England. Occurring later in the novel, this religious and political intrigue in a French convent reinforces the conflict hidden at the recess, showing that turmoil from the past cannot be erased so simply. Lee transforms the typical Gothic heroine the typical Gothic heroine imprisoned for her sexuality into the heroine imprisoned for religio-political reasons, and adds to this event details of schemes against England itself. Here, the danger that France represents links Lee's novel with histories of her period. As Linda Colley explains in her study, Britons Forging the Nation, these histories helped to create a myth of a united and powerful Britain by focusing on the battle between Protestantism and Catholicism abroad rather than on political dissension or religious dissension at home. As Colley observes, Protestantism was the foundation that made the invention of Great Britain possible in the 18th century by uniting Scotland, Wales, and England against common enemies, those of the Catholic states of Europe, particularly France. By making Matilda a Protestant Scottish woman victimized by French Catholics, Lee follows this prescription for British unity and identity. She uses the French as a distraction from the buried Catholic threat inside Britain, and even transforms that threat by representing Matilda as a victim, thus emphasizing the powerlessness of Matilda and the Catholic Scottish threat with which she is associated. Yet, as the gloomy recess and the French convent call to mind, Matilda still represents a threat from within Britain because of her lineage as the daughter of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. That the novel also explicitly details conflicts with Scotland and Ireland, including war and espionage, further complicates a merely sentimental reading of Mary, Queen of Scots in this novel and of history as written by Sophia Lee. The Recess exposes the sentimental and nationalist myth of a unified British front, not simply because of religion, for Matilda and Ellinor are not Catholic, but because of political struggle from within, the real threat posed by Ellinor and Matilda as usurpers of the throne. The Recess, a spot marked by horror and ghostly visits from the past, must be linked with the convent, another spot of Gothic fear, to complete this exposure. In the twins' hands throughout the novel, Enlightenment historiography becomes a dangerous tool to play with, and their suffering in large part results from their desire to make history, and from their naive belief that by providing objective evidence and drawing sympathy from readers and friends alike, they inevitably will succeed. At the same time, their attempts and Ellinor's madness bring up a more haunting uneasiness that lies at the heart of Enlightenment historiography as portrayed in the novel. Just as the Recess hides a growing threat to the English throne in the guise of the two fictional daughters of Mary, Queen of Scots, so too does the historical narrative attempt to hide history's horrors. The girls leave the recess, and Ellinor's madness leads to successful political action. What might happen if historiography cannot hold together and pass on the narrative of a nation's successful progress and unified people? What if this leads to insurgency or even rebellion at home? The novel remains a narrative of impending doom, all the more frightening because it does not answer these questions. The history written by Matilda and Ellinor doesn't have any real power in the world of the novel. And yet, in the real world of the 18th century, as Anna Letitia Barbold feared in her review, this novel did affect people's prejudices in the 18th century about Queen Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots. In a novel that continually shifts perspectives and throws into question what is real, objective, or complete, the Gothic elements repeatedly bring the fear and horror surrounding historical representation to the forefront. Thank you very much.